Well, welcome everybody. Michael Frank, welcome. I'm Sarah Stein, and I am the director of the Alan D. Levy Center for Jewish Studies. And on behalf of the center, I want to welcome you to today's virtual book talk, which highlights author Michael Frank's new book, 100 Saturdays, Stella Levi and the Search for a Lost World, an extraordinary new publication available through Simon and Schuster and wherever your local independent bookstore may be, as well as online. This event is part of our Viterbi family program in Mediterranean Jewish Studies. And I want to thank not only the Viterbi program, but also our wonderful staff for making this happen. And we want to thank all of you who are watching this now for continuing to tune into our programming and staying socially distant while also being intellectually engaged. Now,
thank you, Sarah, for that and for having me, of course.
My pleasure. Michael Frank's book, 100 Saturdays. Michael, your book is an intertwined history. The history of Stella Levi, the history of the unusual, astonishing Jewish community of the island of Rhodes, 500 years Ottoman, Italian, Nazi occupied, Greek, but also a history of a conversation between the two of you and a friendship that unfolds over 100 days of visitation. And it struck me that it was interesting that you weren't introduced. You didn't introduce yourself. That Stella Levi made her presence known to you, and that was how your relationship began. And I wondered if you perhaps tell us about that moment and what it already signaled about this friend that you were in the process of acquiring.
Starting with a really nice, sharp, and difficult question. I love that, Sarah. Thank you so much. But, I think about the book, I don't even know what to call it, but I've been calling it an encounter. Because it really is an encounter between two people, a storyteller and a listener, who then in turn becomes a storyteller of the story that he listened to. But also, I wanted to capture what it was like to listen to the story, so that the book kind of operates on a number of levels. This is sort of the framework around the central issue or the central subject of importance, which is Stella's life growing up in the Juderia through the deportation in 1944 to Auschwitz, along with the rest of her community, through her time in the camps and into the period of the post-war years, and how she came to terms with the life that she'd been given. You ask about the first encounter. It's funny because I live right across the street from Casa Italiana, which is the center of the Italian department for New York University, and I'm often go there to lectures. I'm always late, and I hurried in late because I live across the street to a lecture fittingly in 2015 on the subject of memorials, specifically memorials to the Shoah, the Holocaust. And the only open seat available was the one next to Stella. I sat down and we began chatting. And, she asked me why I was late, and I told her I'd been finishing up my French lesson. And then she asked me if I would be interested in knowing how French served her in her life. And of course, I now understand how provocative Stella is as a person and as a storyteller. And she was seeding right there, I'm sure without being fully conscious of it, the entire project that was going to unfold between us in the following 6 years.
It struck me that moment reflected something that would come up again and again in your book, which was her intuition, her warmth, her ability to be a quick and astute judge of character, but also her fearlessness in being willing to start a conversation, whether in times of desperation, at the worst moments of desperation on a train to Auschwitz, or in a quieter moment of meeting someone at the seaside. But these moments of personal connection, improvised personal connection, were so defining to who she is, who she was as a person through her life.
Yes, that's very perceptive of you. I haven't put that together, those moments together. And I've watched her in the world, of course, as well as in our own cocoon. And she is a person, at least at nearly 100, but I think probably for a few decades before that, who is determined to connect with people. And I think she must have been like that. I know she was like that when she was a young woman in Rhodes because of the variety of people she connected with, both within her somewhat closed community and then in the larger Italian-inflected milieu in which she found herself more and more often as she grew into a teenager and a young adult. Yes, it's fascinating. Her character and behavior are intertwined so tightly that you could argue that in some ways they've directed her fate. Do you know what I mean? I mean, certain key moments all came about in her life because of human connection. And there she was making one with me at this conference table 5 years ago. Sorry, 7 years ago now.
Yes, it's fascinating. And it seems to me that the other thing that is interesting about this moment of encounter is that she chose you. And there
Right.
is a second moment in the book, shortly, just a handful of pages after this one, where you visit her for the first time. She is to give you a piece of writing that she has done about her childhood and to ask for perhaps to ask for editorial input, but perhaps really more to talk.
Right.
And you at that point begin with a question. And it isn't the obvious question. It isn't tell me about your life. It isn't tell me about Rhodes. It certainly isn't tell me about the war. The question is, and I'm reading from page 9, why don't you tell me when you first knew you were different? So I wonder why you asked that question.
I couldn't begin to tell you, Sarah. I think I had my own intuition about her, which was that she was both of that world and not of that world. And I think that's turned out to be correct. She was very much formed, of course, and marked by the Sephardic Jewish community in which she was raised. A very, in some ways, quite old world, as you know probably better than I do. But there was something about her that was a little bit different, that began to manifest itself, express itself early when, for example, she came up with the idea at 14 that she wanted to go to university, an idea that was unique among the girls. I think there was only one other one in the entire community who even thought of it, and only one who went. Or, for example, when as she saw all of her sisters and all of her young friends and the sisters of her young friends, women friends, start preparing their trousseau at 15, 14, 16, embroidering, sewing, buying, ironing, and she wanted nothing to do with that. She had no wish to be married off before she knew who she was as a human being, which was a striking idea in as it was the early 30s, which will sound quite modern to us, but not in that community, in that island, and at that time.
Wonderful. Um, so I know that you expected me to lead with questions about Jewish Rhodes because I am a scholar of the Sephardic world and you and I have had many questions, but I'm not willing to leave this theme quite yet. And
That's okay. That's even better.
Amused by myself that I skipped over the traditional introduction, literary introduction of you, and I'm going to weave that introduction in now with a related question to the way we've begun. So Michael, you're the author of 2 additional books beyond this one. The Mighty Franks, a memoir about growing up on a kind of island, on a kind of Jewish island.
Yes.
And yet that island was a canyon
yes.
in Los Angeles. And after that award-winning memoir, you wrote a novel, What Is Missing, about a love affair between a man and a woman in Italy, a man and a woman of different ages in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
And it strikes me that although 100 Saturdays is very much a book about Jewish Rhodes and about this wonderful woman, Stella Levi, and we will talk about her and about Jewish Rhodes at length, it could also be a kind of dialectic of these two books coming together, an interesting and to follow that with a question. I guess I would ask once again what you saw in this conversation that would extend for so long, and what you saw in her eyes that you refer to so many times, that sparkle which comes and goes depending on the nature of your conversation.
Another perceptive little assembly of evidence and intuition on your end, Sarah. There are a lot of different ways to answer that question. The first thing to say, though, is that I didn't meet Stella and think, oh, I'm going to write a book about Stella. I really wandered into this experience. I was writing and publishing other books and journalism, and something overcame me. I sound so odd retrospectively to say to you, I had no idea what I was doing. You know, I went to her apartment. I continued a conversation we began that night at Casa Italiana. Yes, I brought my computer and took notes, but as I like to joke, my mother calls and I take notes when she speaks to me on the phone, because that's just who I am. And I realized that Stella hadn't properly told her story before. She'd appeared in some documentaries, she'd written little bits and pieces, but to really tell the sort of beginning to end in whatever order, she'd never done. And that intrigued me, of course. But I knew very little about Jewish Rhodes when I sat down next to Stella, and I'm not Sephardic Jewish myself, though Jewish. I'm curious about it. I'm curious about very curious about Italy's relationship to its Jews. My grandmother was born in the Eastern Mediterranean and fought in what was the Northern Galilee of then Palestine. So there were overlapping reasons for me to be attracted to her and her story. But I was well into our relationship, our conversations, our encounter, maybe almost in the second year before I thought this could be a book. And that's because the way I write is that whatever I'm going to write about has to be very deeply seated in who I am, even though this is her story. And I just didn't feel I was on solid ground for the first year or two. I kept, I think, irritating with her by repeating my questions, wanting to hear stories over and over again. We conducted all of our conversations in Italian, I should add. And so there was the issue of translating both on a level of language and also the living Stella to what would become eventually a written Stella, which they're very different people, very different enterprises. So that's my little preamble to that question. And then the more personal, just to say it in a few words, and psychological one is that I had, when I met her, I had just published this memoir about my aunt, who by some weird coincidence was born in the same year, almost the same month as Stella, was a larger than life, brilliant personality, as Stella in a way also is. And obviously through some blind psychological impulse, I found myself wandering into the orbit of another powerful woman with a story to be told.
Wonderful. Well, I'll let you off the hook, and we'll perhaps come back to this rather Jungian line of analysis at the end, but yes. I would love to let her story loom large. So Stella grows up in this community of the Jewish world of Rhodes, the island of Rhodes. The Rhodes Jewish community, I will say, as someone who has dedicated a career to studying Sephardic culture, is in some ways like the other centers of the Sephardic heartland of Southeastern Europe, and in some ways utterly different. And I thought I would invite you to now begin to sort of tease out that world. It struck me that you told her story in a matriarchal fashion. We learn about her two grandmothers who have very different experiences, and her mother, who has a different experience than the two grandmothers. And we actually learn very little about the grandfathers and the father until quite a way through the story. So I wonder, before we get to Stella's own childhood, if you could talk about these two grandmothers with their divergent paths.
Sure. Maybe we talk more about her grandmothers because she knew them, and her grandfathers had died before she was born. So it's a little bit of an accident of existence, let's call it. But she had her Yes, they were totally different. Her paternal grandmother, who lived in whose house they lived, or they shared the same house, was like many of the women of her generation, wore layers of velvet clothes. Stella never saw her undressed. She never had her hair uncovered. She spoke Judeo Spanish as they all did at home, but not a word of anything else except Hebrew. She went to synagogue every day. Her central occupation was tending the tandoor or sitting on the bench and watching the world go by. When the wonderful story Stella tells about her is that when some of the first tourists started coming to the Juderia, which was the name of the neighborhood in which they lived, and she heard them speaking Spanish, which was close enough to their Judeo Spanish to make her say to her granddaughter, "Oh, look, they're all Jewish. How interesting," because she had no concept. She was so innocent that she had no concept of the wider world. Whereas her grandmother Mazel Tov, who was her mother's mother, was far more worldly. She was one of the healers in the Juderia, also heavily clothed, also with a hat at all times, also never naked, undressed even at the Turkish baths. But she traveled the world. She went to Palestine to, in theory, with the hope of dying, because that's what people wanted to do, as I'm sure you know better than I do, that was like considered an end devoutly to be wished. She never died, so she came home. She practiced cures. She was a healer. She was a wise woman that young people went to when they had marital problems or life problems. She had she was equipped for the world as she lived in it. So Stella grew up with these two very, very different points of view from the two grandmothers. And I think, of course, aligned herself much more with her maternal grandmother because people respected her deeply. They came to her for all kinds of things all the time. And those are the anchoring matriarchs of the world into which Stella was born. She had one grandmother at home, one living in another house, and she was also this grandmother, the healer. It's important probably to say she was the sister of a very rich brother who was a banker. So there was a social hierarchy that these two women, socioeconomic hierarchy represented by the two women, that was very different as well.
So I'm imagining these two women, I don't know the dates of their birth, but let's assume it's early to mid 19th century of the grandmothers.
Yes.
It strikes me that we have a hint of a Jewish community already in the 19th century, shaped at this interesting intersection of a kind of parochialism or localism, but also worldliness at the same time. And
Right.
already we're seeing the movement, the mobility of that community, even if in the people who stay put and watch others come to their door.
There's an exchange, right? Of course. Yeah, it's true.
Right. But Miriam, Stella's mother, was a different sort of creature, and then we will indeed get all the way to Stella herself.
Yeah, her mother strikes me in, how when you hear about someone, you begin to put together an idea about them from traces of stories and evidence. And her mother feels quite modern, though still a woman of the previous generation, in that she had an arranged marriage. She was one of those girls sewing their trousseaux. She didn't have higher education, of course. She never really learned Italian. The Italians took control of the island, as you know, officially as a colony in 1923. But she spoke some Greek. She had Greek friends. She spoke Turkish because her husband's business took him into Turkish communities. So she was a little bit more open linguistically. But most importantly, she was open in her attitudes. She discouraged gossip in a community where it seemed like gossip was like with the drinking water, very much in the air, in the system, in the pipes, literal and figurative. Yes, she cooked and followed the Jewish calendar and prepared the house for the holidays, cleaned for Passover, whitewashed, which was particular, it seemed, to Rhodes. Maybe not, you'll correct me, but whitewashed the buildings inside and out. Partook of all of those traditional markers, but then at a certain point she started going to the movies on a Saturday afternoon or go for walks with her good friends. the passeggiata, the things that by contrast, Stella's father never did. He was in a funny way even more traditional. It could have been a masculine traditionality, but it also could have been a strange, like almost generational difference between them, even though they were of the same generation. And so her mother was a wise, insightful, perceptive force in Stella's life. I think Stella being the last born, it should be said, of these siblings, maybe had a lighter touch in the parenting. By that time, I think it's very hard to enforce old traditions and ways on a young, dynamic, aggressive, energetic, and curious youngest daughter. So that might have been part of it. But she did not object when Stella made friends with Italian men who were even older than she was. She didn't object even when the older sister partied all night. She wouldn't listen to anyone talk about her daughters, allow them to be judged, and nor would she judge the daughters of other women she knew in the community. And all of that strikes me as quite unusual.
Yeah, yeah. And it's so interesting to me that her, let's call it modernism, might be marked by the lenience that she showed towards her daughter.
Yes.
Perhaps even
And don't
more
forget,
than, yeah.
and her mother was the mother who kept traveling. So there was a kind of openness that was set generationally before
Yes.
her.
And coming to Stella herself, she is a child in a community of less than 2,000 of Jews
Yes.
on an
Yes.
island with more residents. You
Yes.
know the number. I don't remember it off the top of my head, but where, as you note, she, by her rough estimate, 10% of the community are related to one another,
Right.
which is amazing.
It's
And
insane. Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
but within this community, it really seemed, well, within this community, Stella is vivacious as a young girl. She has a lot of friends.
Yeah.
She seems to be drawn to and attracts a fair amount of male interest as she's
Yes.
a young woman. She loves to read. She loves to swim. She seems so very alive in her
Yes.
version of herself. Tell us a little bit more about her as a young woman.
She's all of the things you said, and she's also, I'm thinking back to when you talked about that look in her eye and her engagement with me that first night. I think I can think of so many examples as she tells it. And don't forget, this is an act of self-portraiture. So the only tools I have really at my disposal in drawing my portrait of her self-portrait is to listen to her, observe her, and do what bits of checking around it I can. So I always want to say that, as I also want to say that, with regard, just to, as open in parentheses, to the historical record as represented in the book, that it is subject to Stella's memory and her refashioning and recasting of herself. And we always want to keep that central. So we are always the heroes of our own stories, most of us. And I think there's a little bit of that at work in Stella. But from the beginning, there's a kind of openness and grittiness about her that I think are very interesting. I sometimes say she's a kind of amalgam of the two young women in My Brilliant Friend, in that she has her reticent moments and her emotional moments, but she's also got her assertive, strong, engaged moments. She absorbs a great deal, and I find that very interesting. She eavesdrops on her intellectual older sister Felicie, for example, who's a fascinating character to me, who sits up at night with her friend Robert Cohen, and they read philosophical texts and have political debates and never seem to have anything romantic going on between them except for the romance of ideas and language. She hears her sister say she doesn't believe in God, for example, which awakens her to a possibility right there. She follows her sister to go visit the archaeological excavations opened up by the Italians when they took control of the island, which gives her, this is like another layer of openness to the wider world. In this case, it's not the contemporary world, but the fact that, let's just say that Stella wouldn't make the mistake of thinking, even as a young girl, that a Spanish speaker was automatically Jewish, because she knows there's something beyond the Juderia. And likewise, she knows that preceding their presence on the island as these Sephardic Jews, presumably eventually making their way there from Spain after the expulsion. There were previous Jews from the ancient world. There were Greeks, there were Romans, there were the Genovese, there were the knights. So she has this wider picture of her place in the universe, which I think then makes it logical that at 14 she could actually, as she famously told me, and it's a story, of course, I love to tell, mockingly, actually, pretend, but packed a suitcase, made a symbolic action for her mother and father, saying, I'm going to go to university. Not I'm going to run away, which what another 14-year-old might do, but I'm going to go to university. And that idea, I think, it's certainly on the presenting level, it comes because the Italians are there and there's an idea that a woman could actually be educated. But I think there are all these other things feeding it, bearing down on it, that started in her earlier childhood.
And she loved books. She loved to read.
She loved to read, of course, and reading, like as Felicie read. She was probably the second most bookish in the family. And as we know, that opens worlds, as it did for her.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And it strikes me that Jewishness conditions their pace, their community, rituals, religious as well as medicinal and spiritual, at
Right.
least maybe among an older generation, but not necessarily Judaism as such. It doesn't appear that she is, or even perhaps her mother is, observant.
No, I think the father went religiously to synagogue. He followed that weekly ritual of Shabbat, bath, meal, synagogue all day Saturday, that Shabbat meaning Friday evening, all day Saturday, synagogue, home. The mother was already on a different vector, absolutely. Right. And I think, I think that the world was in its transition toward modernity there, so to speak. There were a lot of forces tugging it away, but there was a choice. The mother obviously chose to go one direction, and the father stayed in another.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I love that she loves water so much. And I actually had my own exchange with her by email to ask her, before your book was published, to ask her about her swimming, because I had read about this in other sources. And she's not the only one I've encountered of women, young women, or members of this Sephardic community, widely conceived, to love the water. But she does love the water so much, and she's a strong woman and a strong swimmer.
Yes, she's physically strong. It's important to say that too. Yes, and a strong swimmer who, when the crawl arrived, was introduced in the 30s, was not how they were swimming then. They were doing the breaststroke, apparently. She took to it very well. When she was taught how to dive, there was a floating diving board, the trampolino was called, in the water, like right off their beach or off the other beach, the next beach over. She was one of those girls lined up, one of those kids lined up and ready to jump off that diving board at any time. She wasn't a boater, which I find interesting. They didn't go on little boat trips to other islands. She had never left Rhodes until the deportation. Her mother had
gone, so arresting.
Yeah, me too. I mean, her mother had gone to have water cures at a nearby island. Her grandmother had gone, of course, to Palestine, but she had never been off the island, not even for a boat ride. It's really kind of crazy when you think about it.
It is extraordinary, especially because there is a lot of movement in and from and to this community. Members of the family are emigrating to the Belgian Congo, to the United States.
But they're emigrating. They're not going on day trips or, let's go spend the weekend. It's like, this is where sometimes when you're reading about the ancient world, you think, we're just like the Romans. And then you'll come upon something like, yes, there was fun for them to watch people get killed. You're like, well, actually, we really like them. That's a little too dramatic. But it's like they were like us, and they were modern, the style in that world. But then they weren't, because, they weren't having weekends in the countryside, or weekends. They would have morning trips, day trips, walks, hikes. But to leave their island, which, was not done and or very little done. And I think that adds yet another layer of resonance to this whole question of, to whom does this land belong, right? I mean, they're so connected to it. They've been there ancestrally for half a millennium nearly. And as she says to me, and she says often, we considered it our own little piece of the earth. And what does that mean to actually believe this is your soil, and then to find out that, of course, it's not.
Right, indeed. I've read accounts of pre-World War II Rhodes that the Juderia that mentions that the Rhodesali Jews were particularly famous for their flower pots and for filling their courtyards and their streets with flower pots. So
Yes.
one gets the sense of a a melding with the natural surroundings, of an opening the house up to the surrounding landscape, and these trips for hiking and to the water.
Yes. Yes. And the houses themselves were permeable in the sense that doors and windows were left open. It's very interesting when Stella talks about the warriors and how the doors started being closed and, in fact, locked. They were never locked, and they were very often not closed. And so that, which is one of the ways information, music, the scent of smells of food cooking, all of this was shared across these cortijos. It's, I guess, a little bit, I live in New York, a little bit like, the back courtyards where you have a sense of what's going on. We're not open and friendly like that, or even that interested, but you have a bit of a sense of what's going on in these buildings around you. But for them, it was all day long exchange of information and perception, which I find, both fascinating and a little bit alarming too. And I think Stella did as well. I think there was a beauty in it, but there was also, like, she came home too late at night, as I write in the book, it was known by 7 mothers within 3 seconds.
Right. She strikes me the contemporary Stella, with whom you had all of these wonderful conversations, seems to me to be a master of discretion. So I imagine that the youthful Stella would have bristled against the actual transparency of information as it flowed through the neighborhood.
And maybe the only place you could draw those boundaries was in what you, and her mother too. She must have gotten that from her mother. I'm just thinking about that now. One of the ways you can draw those boundaries is choosing not to say something. That is a boundary. Silence, or self-editing is a boundary. And it wasn't one rapidly, or rather, widely practiced, from what I can tell.
Right. The other way is to swim away from land.
Yeah. So and to go out and about, to leave the neighborhood.
Yeah, and I'd love to talk about the social life, and this will, I think, slowly transition us to the war years. The social world, where she is so close to sisters, cousins, friends, and slowly to men, a number of dear friends, especially 3 dear male friends, all of whom have a tie to Italy, all of whom are Italian.
They're Italian. They're all Italian, yeah. Well, I mean, one thing to say, of course, is that the social life, the social, what's the right word for this? The I want to say the pot, basically the opportunities changed as Stella grew older, because the economics of the island changed. And so this is, from what I understand, directly tied to the Italians coming. And in some ways, it was harder to conduct these small family-owned businesses and banks as successfully as they had been operating in this relative balance with the Turkish and Greek communities, which is the main thing to say, of course, is that under the Ottomans, of course, with problems that, and they are documented, but I think in the aggregate, there was a compatibility among these different communities. And in the 20s and 30s, there was a shift, as many of the dynamic young men left the island. And so that puts a real change on the complexion of this sort of social pot from which Stella can draw. And then it's further complicated by some of the women also going away to be married to these men who would come back. They would come back from the Congo, they would come back from New York or California and go to the matchmaker or the uncle or the aunt to find a wife. That's how Stella's sister and her first two oldest sisters left. So it shrinks down. So two things happen. One is they start to become friends across the age groups, which I find very interesting. They weren't all in their sort of peer or age cohorts. And so the fewer of them, the more the boundaries break down from that point of view. And then, of course, they turn with interest and curiosity to the Italians, women and men in particular, maybe in Stella's case. But so marks a real change in the nature of her life when the Jewish men of the Juderia are very, very few, and then the women are mixed together in different ages.
Yeah, it's interesting. She's also the youngest of seven siblings, and therefore accustomed to older.
Exactly, and so more comfortable with older young people. And also her next sister in line, Renee, was much more particular socially and fastidious and didn't cross those boundaries as nimbly or naturally as Stella did. So, I have my own personal theory about sibling order, that you kind of change yourself in reaction to who your siblings are. I mean, I can't begin to imagine how that functions when you have 6 older siblings, but we should also remember that when Stella and Renee, her next older sister, were born, the oldest brother, Maurice, had already left for California. So they never met until after the war. And then soon after that, when she was 6, Selma left, and a few years later, Sarah left. And so the family was shrinking, again, leaving more possibility for connection with other people.
Yes. So she is, am I correct, in high school in 1938 when the race laws are implemented?
Yes. So she's heading into what would be, in the Italian system, high school, which would be 5 years and would prepare her for university. And of course, it's the thing she's been most wanting to do. Felicie, the bookish reading sister, was the only one of all of the siblings to have a high school education. And when Stella started with the suore, they started at the medie, like the lower level, with a group of girls from the Juderia. Some stayed and went to the local equivalent. We'll just put it in American terms for ease of conversation. Went to a local middle school, but it wasn't as intellectually rigorous. And Stella and a handful of girls and boys left the Juderia to go to school with the sisters. Where they intended and where Stella intended and hoped to continue, of course, when in 38, they were all forbidden from going to school, period.
Yes.
And she experienced that, as she has said many times, as just a devastating experience to her. I'm so with her in understanding, as a bookish and curious person myself. And this intellectual, ambitious, anti-Trousseau making young woman knows on some level that the path out is through education. And Mussolini and the fascists say you are no longer worthy of being educated.
Mm-hmm. The path out is through education and also through contact with a wider world of interlocutors. And she is
yes.
So I was quite amazed by her telling of the illegal school that then takes shape in the home of some form other instructors who have been forced out of teaching. And she is the only girl to join among a cohort of boys.
Yes. So actually, no, these were 3. Well, one day after the racial laws, in the local bookstore, which was still open in the Juderia, she runs into a man called Luigi Noferini, who was the professor of Italian or letters or literature at the boys' equivalent, like the high school for the boys. There was the girls and the boys, and he knows what's happened and says, "Well, what are you doing? What's the plan?" As though there could be a plan, which was a sort of surprising possibility to Stella. And standing there in that bookstore, which I think is like the perfect place to have a conversation like this, they hatch a plan he offers to create a kind of shadow school after his official duties. He corrals a few other professors, and they meet in secret in different houses of these teachers. And it is interesting that Stella's the only girl. And I said to her, well, did you ask? I asked other girls, and they didn't want to go. So this again sets her apart. She and 5 boys cycle through these different professors' houses, and they keep them on target, for the curriculum and the big test known as the maturita, which they take at the end of high school and allows them to apply to university. Absurd, given that they're not allowed to go to school at the moment. This is happening, but the attitude of Noferini is, well, when this war business, this fascism business is over, you'll be able to go to school, and so might as well continue to study.
Mm-hmm. And you write of how she described to you, at one moment, one of the teachers sees something in the windowsill, and they realize that they're being bugged. They're being tapped by the fascist, I assume, the police.
Yes, I mean, it's since emerged that there was a lot of surveillance going on, not just of the Jews, but of all of the subjects of all of the residents of the island by the Italians. It's not something we tend to think of, but they kept some mighty strong spy mechanisms in operation. They kept remarkable records. They found, about 7 years ago now, in the police office on Rhodes, they opened a long closed closet and found 90,000 documents. This is a well-known story, which Marco Clemente has written about in his book. Surveying the communities of the island, including the Jews. No one has corroborated the microphone story. It's interesting, but this is one of those moments where I decided to go with Stella. I've been told that there was no other discovered or substantiated in such instance, but I don't think she made it up either. Yeah, so I tell it.
And it is indeed plausible. I mean,
yeah, well, very plausible when you see the documents, some of the documents that did emerge.
Yes, and what strikes me as more implausible is that they were allowed to continue conducting this shadow school as long as they did.
Right, exactly. That's a good point.
So the race laws
but they weren't being, sorry, the professor being bugged, I should clarify though, wasn't being bugged because he was teaching these kids. He was being bugged because he was an outspoken opponent of the fascist regime. So that was the motivation for if he was being bugged, and not because he was teaching these kids.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So the race laws are introduced in 1938, but the community continues really until the fall of 1944.
Fall of 43, yes.
Excuse me, fall of 43 to exist in a limbo.
Yes, this is fascinating to me, and I think to those of us who are very Ashkenazi centric, or Northern Europe or Western European centric in our understanding of what went on in those years. So, of course, until and even after the Germans seized the island from the Italians in the fall of 43, really up until really up until days before the deportation in July of 44, life changes and then reverts and then changes again. So they're for a time forbidden from going to the cinema. These are all part of the racial laws in mainland Italy, of course, from going to the beach, from the list is so long, from seeing non-Jewish doctors, from having single ownership of the business without an Italian partner, from continuing the membership in or even attending the social club, which is known as the Circolo d'Italia, from going to the opera house, if there was even still opera being put on at that point, it's not clear. So all of this is put immediately in effect. But then, no one's paying quite such close attention because we are in Rhodes after all. We're living, I sometimes call it the Malibu of the Mediterranean, which is, I think, probably how it felt to them. Out the door is the beach. Everything is fragrant. There, fruit is growing, wild with roses and flowers. And it just wasn't that severely administered or these laws enforced. They went back to the beach. They went back to the cinema. They did not go to the Circolo d'Italia. It was like very hit and miss about what they could and could not do. And so, and of course, this leads us to the whole question of like, and it has to be said quite delicately. I was like, did they know what was going on elsewhere? That leads us to that. But Stella adamantly contends that they did not, and I understand why they did not, because their reality was not so deeply altered, except for school and work, So
He maintains adamantly that they did not know, but it seemed to me that in the course of your conversations, that determination wanes just a touch.
Well, yes. Let's back up to say a little bit that they, for example, they had no access to their access to media was access to censored media. So the local paper was fascist run and increasingly publishing anti-Semitic content. They listened to Radio Londra, which was BBC in secret, because of course they were, in theory, forbidden from owning radio, so they still did, but they listened to them quite carefully, so no one would hear them. Information arrived in the Juderia from, we haven't mentioned it, but there were refugee boats that were trying to get to Palestine that were docking there, or two that were famously shipwrecked near Rhodes, whose passengers / refugees came to Rhodes and lived there for a long period. They knew what was going on there to those Jews, but they had a different sense of their own safety.
Yes.
Yes.
Now
it's a really tough one, because I think in a way I feel like I put Stella on the spot when I asked some of those questions, because, and who am I to be looking back from my very informed perspective? It's a very delicate act of imagining a combination of not being informed and perhaps being to some degree in denial, because we should also point out that the well-to-do families who had means and connections got out of there, or got their children out of there.
Well, there is also the line of thought that to have a sense of this information, but to continue to live your life as if you did not know, is itself a form of resisting a regime.
Sure. That makes sense to me. Yeah.
It is difficult to come to the story of deportation and her and the family's deportation to Auschwitz, not only because the material is so difficult, but because she herself resisted telling you or telling anyone.
Mm-hmm. Yes, this was, of course, this was a.
Yeah, it wasn't clear to you that you would ever hear it from her.
Exactly. And we'll take a step back. Why is her story important to me, an important period? It's important because, yes, Stella is 100 years old now, and with her eyes and body and brain and memory have lived in that place at that time, and that is remarkable unto itself. But what brings our attention into focus inevitably is that world was extinguished, really, literally overnight, when the entire population of the island was deported. And it is what gives her story its anxiety and reverberation, and I'm not going to say weight, because it holds weight unto itself, but it is the thing that one wants to know. And I think Stella really, quite understandably, didn't want to begin there, and didn't want to be defined by her time in the camps. But I think she came to see that it was once we had spent so much time, as you and I have, even in our talk, mirroring in a way her preference, as the book does. Also, it's 50 of 100 chapters talking about Rhodes, and then we go to the camps, and then the aftermath. And I think she trusted my impulse and trusted herself that she could convey that experience and not sensationalize it and not give it greater weight than the rest of her life, but tell it as though the same way that she told me about everything else she told me in her life. And so we come to Stella, we come to what happens, we come to see that, especially looking back, I think that a lot of the characteristics and traits that you've put your finger on about her as a young woman end up serving her quite well. She herself says it's luck, suerte, that enabled her to survive. I'm not 100% sure that that's right. You know, a famous a scholar of the Holocaust said to me, all the survivors say they had luck, you know, and that was not in itself everything. She had that great, quick thinking brain. She had an engagement with people. And I think above all, she bonded with her fellow Sephardic, or fellow Jews, Rhodesli Jews, but also other Jews in the camps. And she made it work, you know.
Mhm. The timing of this is always so extraordinary to me because, like the Jews of Budapest, the Jews of Rhodes, it is the very end, you know.
Yeah.
And they have the Jews from the islands of Rhodes have the single longest deportation of any community.
Yes.
That 8-day boat ride followed by train, um, reaching Auschwitz in August of 1944.
Yeah.
How long is she in the camp before she leaves to go westward as a forced
She's in
laborer?
Auschwitz under 2 months. She's in camps in general 9 months. Um, Auschwitz is, of course, the most perilous of the places, although there were other ways to die other than being, you know, exterminated because illness, at which she becomes ill, the number of marches and terrible weather and so on, starvation and despair also contribute to, you know, the danger. Um, Sometimes when I give those statistics, I think are people thinking, oh well, that's not so very long, you know, and as though that mattered in a way. And I think that what I like to say is that, as Stella told me, virtually overnight, after upon arrival, she's separated from her parents who are taken away, and her aunts and uncles, and a cousin who's holding her baby. She's left with her next older sister, Renee, and a group of friends. They bond in this solid unit. But she says, and she says it to me almost marveling still 7+ decades later, that she thinks I'll come over someday now, even we still are talking and still see each other. And she'll say, I still wonder who that person was
Mhm.
there, because she had to do a complete, I would argue not 100% complete, but a complete change in the sense that she went from being a good girl in all the senses that mean, I mean, we could think of that meaning, to being a terror in the sense that she robbed, she stole, she cheated, she connived, she betrayed, anything to keep herself, her sister, and her friends fed and to keep themselves relatively clean and clothed. And I think that she spent a lot of her life thinking about how that can happen to a human being so quickly and so effectively.
It struck me how many times she, but also you, invoked Primo Levi's writing when it came to your discussions and your writing of this period in Auschwitz.
Yeah.
His literariness, of course, his embrace of an Italian uh, erudite philosophical world, his appreciation of the impossibility of retaining normalcy under
Yes.
abnormal conditions.
Yes, I think, you know, he's a sort of they're not related, by the way, though they have the same last name. I think, you know, it's nice to have a touchstone and to kind of run check things against parallel experiences. But as she often points out, he was saved because he had a profession which was in demand in the camps, and certainly even more dramatically, psychologically more resonant and problematic for Stella is that he got to go home to his family and his life and his world. And neither Stella nor any of the Jews, the surviving Rhodes Jews, except later on a handful here and there, went back to Rhodes to their homes. And I just find that even among the, I mean, there's so many things to think about and linger over and trying to understand. We go back to where we began our conversation. We have a young woman who's never left the island, who knows it like the back of her hand, who breathes it, whose grandmothers live there, whose families are buried in the cemetery, whose uncle endowed the school endowed positions in the school or the school for children of lesser means. And it's not like it was bombed and destroyed, although it was also bombed, but her house still stood. Her house and her friends' houses, many of them were still standing, and they did not go back.
Well,
and so that's a big difference.
It was a cultural bomb, one could say.
It was a cultural bomb, yeah.
What was the fate of Felicia, her sister?
Felicie, what left on the last steamship to leave from Naples in 1940. So she left Rhodes in one of the last possible moments. Where she went with an aunt and uncle, an aunt and uncle who were among the people leaving. And the father had tried, this is very pertinent following the Ken Burns documentary, the father, like Otto Frank, had tried to get the whole family out, and they were turned down because there were too many of them. And so they sent Felicie. Why Felicie? She was the next oldest in line. Maybe that was the thinking. Stella retrospectively thinks that maybe Felicie, it was understood into the degree that they understood. So this is where all of that reasoning gets a little bit foggy. Might not have done so well in the experience that was awaiting them. I don't know if I can't imagine the parents thought that. I think she was the next oldest, and it sort of went in sibling order.
And does she?
So she went to California, and it's very poignant. This great brain of the family went to work as a seamstress, and later on she worked in the office of a retirement home. She, from Stella's point of view, never became the thing that she was supposed to become, but you really begin to filter that through and do some more objective prodding of Stella and thinking. She became quite left-wing. She was always politically outspoken. She was a big protester in Berkeley, in the 60s. She was incredibly generous and helped support her younger sisters. She would help take care of children. She was a rich human being who didn't become what Stella would have imagined and preferred her to become.
Yes. But I understand that for people for whom ideas and discussion and learning and books mattered so much, the theft of that experience of a full chapter of study taken by politics, taken by fascism, is a cruel blow that one would never forgive, or
crippling, I think, yeah.
So to follow Stella's own story further, she undergoes these various confusing moves across Europe by foot, often to different camps where she continues to be forced to labor in different capacities.
Yes.
And she is interned when it is American soldiers, correct, who liberate the camp in which she is interned in Germany.
Exactly. Yes, they come along. They were on their way to Dachau and did not even know that this little sub camp was there. And she wakes up one morning, and some of the men, the co-prisoners, are saying, the Germans have gone and they've disappeared. And I also try to think what that was like. They've been living under authority for that past near year, and now there's no one running the show. What does that even mean? Where's the food going to come from? How is it going to even function? And the Americans come, and the Red Cross comes, and they're free.
And she
they're free. They can walk out the door and go wherever they want, but without papers, without money, without people, without parents, without a home, what happens to you, you know?
Without
And
knowledge of
without,
the fate of
yes,
her
without
family.
exactly all of it. I mean, they like
Right.
thousands of people.
She describes a moment around this time. I don't. There's no date lent to it, I believe, where she is being driven by a soldier um, uh, into Italy, I believe,
Yes.
and the soldier gives her some money, or maybe this is still in Germany, and she goes into town and she buys some lipstick.
This is her cousin who does that. Her
Okay,
cousin hitches a
okay,
ride with an American soldier, goes into Munich, and gets and comes back with lipstick. It's right after the Americans come.
Stella would have bought a book, perhaps. I don't know.
I think Stella was happy to put on the lipstick also, quite
Yeah,
honestly. I think,
yeah, but that
yeah,
thirst for normalcy.
so
For
intense. And the first thing this cousin, I mean, this wonderful cousin, her cousin Sarah, who was fearless and reckless, if you ask me, but lucky also, all those
Right.
things. Who knows what the admixture is? Said, let's put on a show. You know, like they wanted to sing and dance. You know, they sang and danced in the camps. It's a hard thing to get our brain around. Again, it doesn't fit with our kind of whatever that picture is. A lot of us have,
Well, you
but
also
they kept
mentioned laughter, that they laughed a
and
lot in the
laughed.
camp.
They used to laugh at the insane things that were happening. They retain, you know, on the one hand, she became that conniving, thieving young woman who understood organizer, the word of Yiddish that she learned to take care of things, to make things work for them. On the other hand, they retained what humanity they could through friendship, sharing, laughing, singing, and dancing. You know,
Mhm.
yeah.
Well, and or I don't know which, it is the memory that she today, in her 90s, as you were talking to her, wishes desperately to amplify.
This is, of course, the big question. You know, how do you tell someone I'm sitting in my bed starving? How
Yeah.
do you tell someone I'm lying in my, in my cot, afraid that I will be killed
Yes.
tomorrow? You know, they're just words in a way, in a sense. And this is the difference between, a Primo Levi book or Primo Levi's story being told right in the aftermath, the first
Mhm.
book to write about the camps, versus something 7 decades later. Um, and another reason to check in with him and other people now and then, yes,
Mhm.
altogether possible. I don't distrust what she's saying, but I mean, how could you possibly, unless you're keeping like an hour to hour diary of your life, have that balance calibrated in a way that truly reflects what went on?
Of course.
Yeah,
Michael, I was wondering if I could ask you to read a page, and it will
sure.
take us to a closing question that will perhaps return us to something we began with, if you're willing.
Hold on 1 second while
Okay,
I get a
sure.
copy of the book, which we can conveniently hold up for everybody who might not
Oh,
have
indeed.
seen it.
Actually, before I have you read, could I have you say something about the choice to have the book illustrated by Moira Kalman?
Thank you. Um, as we began saying at the start of this talk, that this book is, I think of it as an encounter. So I am filtering Stella's story through my experience of Stella, through a translation from Italian to English, from a person of an older generation to a person of a younger generation, and through her own, as we just discussed, um, filter of memory. I felt that photographs, a handful of which remarkably survived. Why? Because they were sent with these siblings who left as memories of their childhood, because nothing remained of the ones that would have been in the house. I felt that it was too literal to illustrate with photographs. And Myra heard about the book and offered to paint uh, illustrations based on the existing photographs. So I thought, oh, that makes sense, because it gives a certain sense of, it's a different encounter with the story, visual encounter. And the one thing I think she achieved quite beautifully that was hard for me was to evoke the sensuality and lusciousness, the richness, the color of Rhodes, because I can write that there were red geraniums growing in the cortege, as you pointed out, that there were these wonderful flowers in their in their life, in their gardens, but it's quite different to see them, I think. So that
Yeah,
was
there is the illustrations highlight a youthful vibrancy, which
yes,
is quite wonderful.
yes.
So what I was hoping you would read is the 208 to the top of 209.
Okay. And where would you like me to start?
If it's not too long, start at the top of 208.
Sure. This is, as we're winding down, it's late in the book, in chapter 94 of 100. Stella goes on to add that there were plenty of people who already told their stories well, besides, notably for her, Primo Levi himself. And there was a personal reason why she resisted telling her story. She heard a critical voice in her mind, largely her own critical voice, she sees that now, asking who she thought she was, wondering by what authority she was to speak about the Juderia, about the life that happened there and afterward. But her thinking has changed over the years, especially as she's grown older. Many things come to you late in life, she tells me. I've never said this before to anyone, but when you arrive at a certain age, you're no longer afraid of being ridiculous. After a moment, with her eyes glimmering, she adds, and then you came along and you were curious and patient with me, even though I wasn't always so easy. And in speaking to you, I've learned a great deal about myself. As I tell you my stories, I learn. One thing I learn is that there is no single truth. There's a changing truth along that cammin de la nostra vita, and that you understand a good deal from going back, returning and more than once to what you thought you knew and felt and believed. And in the end, I trusted you. I point out that it took her a while before she actually did. You have to earn trust, Michael. Wouldn't you agree? The look she gives me now, I might once have characterized as fierce. I no longer see it that way. I see it as the look of someone who is fully present, unafraid to speak her mind, unwilling to make difficult moments easy or palatable, and who is above all truthful, or as truthful as she can be given the way memory behaves and the mind evolves over time. I do agree, I say, but I think also that it might require a leap of faith on both sides. Stella takes this in. We both took that leap, I believe. The silence that envelops us feels almost material, to be made of something tangible like cloth, like a large sail or tent, a sail that has captured the wind that carried us on this journey, a tent that has defined and enclosed our time together, our many Saturdays over these many years. There's something else, Stella says after a moment. Oh? Well, our talking, it seems like it's kept me alive.
Thank you. So, Michael, I am drawn to ask you by way of closing what those 100 Saturdays did for you.
A great closing to go with all those great opening questions, Sarah. I'm just wrangling with that right now, I have to say. I'm still coming to understand how changed I am by this experience. There's this wonderful quote from Walter Benjamin that I'm fond of using. I happen to have it right here, so I'm going to read it to you. In his review of a book in 1936, he's called The Storyteller. It's an essay, really. And he says, the storyteller finds his material in experience, his own or what he has learned secondhand. And the stories he tells, in turn, become experience for his audience. And I take that to mean that the stories you hear become part of you, and the stories you tell become even more so a part of you. And I feel that Stella's story is, in fact, part of me now. And Stella and the Jews of Rhodes are now a sort of touchstone through, that I return to, that I think about, a prism through which I see lots of things in life, including, of course, the story of the war years, Italy's relationship with its Jews, America's relationship with the war, and I've metabolized, in some ways, become part of my metabolism, and I'm very grateful to have had the experience.
Well, thank you so much, Michael Frank, for speaking with me today for this. Congratulations on the wonderful book, and
thank you
for letting not only the story of the Jews of Rhodes come to life, but to teasing out the character of this extraordinary 100-year-old woman who may be its last living legacy.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.